One day, a woman received an anonymous express delivery. When she opened it, to her shock, she found it was a set of sexy lingerie inside. A note fell out of the package, filled with extremely explicit words. It turned out that this was a package sent by the mistress to provoke her. Only then did the woman realize that her husband might be having an affair. She recalled a mysterious figure that appeared during a video call when her husband was on a business trip. She decided to go to the place where her husband was on a business trip to catch him in the act. She arrived at the hotel. Inside the room, the two were having a passionate spree. She opened the door and saw clothes strewn all over the floor. She was shocked and furious. She pushed the door open violently and found that the mistress was actually her own younger sister. She immediately raised her hand and slapped her. Her sister tried to defend herself, but in the end, the two got into a scuffle. The situation was in chaos. Just then, a hand stretched out from under the bed. The two stopped upon hearing the movement. To their surprise, the man under the bed was not her husband, but her sister's boyfriend. Her sister explained that they had just confirmed their relationship and were discovered by her brother-in-law, who then gave them the room. Her sister was puzzled as to why her sister had come suddenly. The woman looked at her sister's nude-colored dress and began to doubt herself. Could the affair really be a misunderstanding? But who sent the anonymous express? Her husband called the express company to prove his innocence. The express company also admitted on the phone that the package was sent to the wrong person by the merchant. The woman felt extremely guilty for suspecting her husband. Her husband not only didn't blame her but also coaxed her repeatedly. At night, the woman overheard a strange conversation between her sister and her husband. To her shock, her sister was actually helping her husband deceive her for money. So her husband really was having an affair. The woman hired a detective to find out who the mistress was. Unexpectedly, the mistress was someone she knew. Her husband, in order to lighten her housework burden, had brought a nanny home. As soon as the woman thought that her husband had dared to bring the mistress into the house brazenly, she flew into a rage. She secretly followed her husband and finally witnessed the scene of her husband walking with the nanny. Thinking that her husband and the mistress had been having an affair right in front of her for half a year while she hadn't noticed at all, the woman was extremely angry. Her husband and the nanny went to the hospital, and the woman tailed them there. Could the nanny be pregnant? The woman angrily walked up to the two and snatched the test report. She found that the name on the test report was her grandmother's. It turned out that her grandmother had leukemia half a year ago. Afraid of worrying her granddaughter, she had asked the woman's husband to keep it a secret from her. Her husband had been taking care of her grandmother while hiding it from his wife. Finally, a suitable bone marrow donor was found among hundreds of people, and that person was the nanny. The woman was at a loss for a moment. Her grandmother asked them to clarify the misunderstandings properly. It turned out that her husband had been on business trips all the time to persuade the nanny to save her grandmother. By chance, her husband had saved the nanny, so the nanny agreed to be the bone marrow donor. All the misunderstandings were explained. The figure in the video call at that time was the nanny. After saving the nanny, her husband had specially opened another room for her. And her sister had only pretended to threaten the man to get more pocket money. After listening to her husband's explanation, the woman's guilt welled up like a tide. On the way home, she was so lost in thought that she had a car accident. Fortunately, She wasn't injured. After the car was repaired, the mechanic reminded her that she could use the dashcam to deal with the subsequent claims. She got into the car to check the dashcam, but unexpectedly heard a conversation between the mistress and her husband. The mistress and her husband had exchanged sweet nothings in this car. The woman realized that it wasn't the nanny's voice. Her husband was indeed having an affair. The woman thought angrily. Who on earth was this mistress? The woman went to the hospital to bring food to her grandmother and unexpectedly overheard a conversation between her grandmother and her husband. Her grandmother had actually known about her husband's affair for a long time but had helped him hide it. Inside the ward, her husband and her grandmother were talking happily, while outside the ward, the woman was heartbroken. At night, the woman was crying alone while looking at the old photos. Just then, her husband came home. Hearing that the woman had had a car accident today, he was very concerned about her. But the woman just kept pushing his hands away. Finally, their quarrel attracted their young daughter. The woman felt very sorry when she saw her crying daughter. She decided to coax her daughter to sleep first. After her daughter fell asleep, the woman and her husband went to the study. The woman questioned her husband's love. Her husband coaxed her with sweet words. The woman took the opportunity to ask her husband to write a guarantee, trying to transfer the property division and the custody of their daughter to herself. After thinking for a while, the man wrote the guarantee to coax her. For the sake of the child, the woman decided not to divorce for the time being, but she was determined to find out who the mistress was. She found the detective again and asked to obtain all the movements of her husband and the woman. One day, the woman's niece came to visit. The niece praised her husband highly. During their conversation, the woman accidentally learned that her niece was in love. Her niece was actually involved with a married man. This fact made the woman extremely angry. Under the pretext of reprimanding her niece, the woman also condemned her husband. Unexpectedly, her husband showed no sign of repentance and even joined in to educate the niece. At this time, the detective called. The detective sent the woman photos and asked her to confirm them as soon as possible. To her shock, the protagonists in the photos were her husband and her niece. It turned out that the niece was adopted by the woman's sister, and her identity was rather suspicious. The niece's praise for her husband echoed in the woman's ears. The woman walked quickly towards the kitchen and unexpectedly saw her husband and her niece entangled with each other.